Hey, what's up guys? Gons here for the Face Like the Sun YouTube channel. This is a conversation I had with Tim Alberino, and for some reason my mic wasn't properly working, so I apologize for my sound, and I decided to not include my video either because for some reason the video and audio are completely out of sync. And so some technical difficulties, but Tim is on screen and you can hear me every once in a while in between. So I'm going to release this in two parts. This is part one. Enjoy the interview with Tim Alberino. Hey, what's up guys? Gons here for the Face Like the Sun YouTube channel. I have a really special guest today, Tim Alberino of Genesis 6 Productions. Tim, how you doing, buddy?
Thanks for having me on, Guns.
So you have been making some pretty awesome documentary films. Puts me to shame the level of research and the production value. Talk about your latest film, True Legends, Episode 2, The Unholy Sea. It's groundbreaking. I think a lot of people watching this may have already seen it, but if not, I definitely recommend you guys check it out, because this is the important stuff. This is the stuff that, I feel like, we were talking about this before, Tim, right before we hit record. There's a lot of distractions right now. There's real stuff happening. There's real stuff being revealed. It's a really intense time in history, but I feel like our community is being distracted by a lot of things that don't matter or are deliberately being put there to be distracted from this important stuff. And I think some of that important information is stuff that you've put out there in this film, Tim. Where did you start in terms of, how to even research this topic?
Well, we began with the True Legends documentary film series. We began from the premise of the 6th chapter of Genesis, that the Watchers descended in the days of Jared, in the world before the flood of Noah, and copulated with human women, and basically, in a nutshell, created a genetic mess, genetic chaos on the earth, which was one of the primary factors that led to the flood of Noah. And so we have been going around the world researching, investigating, visiting key places, key locations on the earth that are relevant to the Genesis 6 narrative, or at least might be relevant to the Genesis 6 narrative, both in terms of its prehistoric implications and its prophetic implications. And so we began in some of the what we consider to be some of the most relevant locations, relevant in a number of ways. We began in Peru and Bolivia because I spent 10 years of my life living in Peru and the Amazon region in South America. And so I was familiar with the culture. I speak the language, which is Spanish. I know my way around Peru, and I have lots of contacts in Peru, so that it made sense for us to begin there, but also because Peru has some of the most impressive megaliths on the planet. And we believe that megaliths are remnants from a pre-flood age, are the remnants of the civilization that existed in the world before the flood of Noah, and are some of the best examples that we can touch, that we can document, that we can talk about and feature in a film representing the time before the flood of Noah, and the technology, hinting at the technology that might have existed in the time before the flood of Noah, and not just the technology, but also the entities that existed in the world before the flood of Noah. So that's why we started in Peru in episode 1, and Bolivia. We went to Tiwanaku, Pumapunku. In episode 2, episode 1 was a to be continued. Episode 2, we pick up where episode 1 left off, but now we go to Rome, we go to the island of Malta, and we're in some different locations in Peru, specifically in the Cusco region. And basically what we discover is that the Catholic Church, specifically the Holy See, is right at the center of the cover-up concerning the pre-flood world and the entities that inhabited it.
Right. It's the cover-up, right? It's the main thing that it seems like the Catholic system has been working very hard to cover for generations. And this, I think people don't realize the scope of history that's been covered up to where, everything that we have been taught in terms of some of the, like the entities that have been covered up, giants, the bones, everything else that you guys have investigated to show that there was something going on in the past that is completely wiped out of history books and history classrooms. And, it makes people question, like, wait a minute, then, what's really happening? But, it's almost too late to even dig into some of the stuff happening before, because the stuff happening now, the stuff being uncovered, the veil's being taken off. Like, these things are being exposed. You guys are part of that, of doing that, in the spirit of Ephesians 5:11. And, I find it fascinating because you can see the ripple effect of something like that throughout everything we talk about. All the talk about the Illuminati, the New World Order, all these topics that are really popular now, they stem from these cover-ups, these central themes that are biblical themes. And this is why I keep telling people, even if you're an atheist, even if you're a complete skeptic, this affects you. The biblical narrative affects you. You're part of this storyline, whether you like it or not. And so you better at least know what's happening, or at least investigate these issues. It's just a fair sort of, offer for people to look into these things. But, the cover-up is so deep. But I found something interesting about these mountains, these mounds, and these pyramids, basically, that you're uncovering as part of your investigation in these films. There's something in human nature that feels a sense of accomplishment, achievement and things like that when we reach the top of a mountain, right? There's a metaphorical thing there, but there's also a physical, hey, I did it, reached the top of a mountain. And in conjunction with that, to the pyramid, the all-seeing eye at the top of the pyramid, in this idea of, trying to conquer, trying to rule, in relationship with, everything we see, the back of the dollar bill, all that stuff, tying into the occult, then tying into the UN and all that stuff. Everything's connected. What have you found about these mountains or mounds that you think were potentially, ancient structures, ancient pyramids? What is it about them that you found fascinating, or how did you even come to that conclusion?
Well, specifically, if you're going to talk about mounds, we actually deal with the mounds and the mound builders. We're going to deal with the mounds and the mound builders in the next episode, which is episode 3, which is actually under production right now. And there's some really exciting stuff going on concerning episode 3. Tom Horn is now on the ground level of the True Legend series. He's joined the True Legend series and is a central part of episode 3, and has a lot of information to add concerning the mounds and the mound builders and the Native Americans in Sardinia. When we were in Sardinia, I went to Sardinia twice with our production team, with our camera crew, and Sardinia is, and for those who don't know where Sardinia is located, it's located off the coast of Rome. Not far off the coast of Rome, right above. It's the island there, basically between Rome and France. In fact, Sardinia is the lower island, the larger island, and above Sardinia is Corsica, which belongs to France, the birthplace of Napoleon. And Sardinia is fascinating because it is very much very analogous to the United States in the late 19th century and early 20th century, when the mounds were still present all over the United States from the mound builder the mound building cultures, which we believe in some cases were giants. And there's a correlation between the situation that was happening here in the United States in the late 19th century and the island of Sardinia. And the situation is very, very similar. Sardinia, just 20 years ago, 30 years ago, maximum 40 years ago, was in a situation in which they were digging the foundations for many of their roads and modernizing their society there on the island of Sardinia, especially in some of the villages. And these are old Italian villages, and so they were digging down to build foundations for buildings. And what was happening was the bones of giants were being discovered time and time again all over the island of Sardinia. And so, and again, these giants were also mound builders in Sardinia, and it was the same kind of situation, as I said, that was happening in the late 19th century here in the United States, and it was showing up in the newspapers. It was a local phenomenon that these bones of giants were being discovered, not just bones, in some cases mummified bodies 15 feet plus. And these entities, these bodies were adorned in gold and silver and precious jewels. So we're not talking about mastodons or giant sloths. We're talking about giants that were wearing rings and necklaces and bracelets. In fact, it was becoming so common that when a body of a giant would be discovered in Sardinia by a farmer or by a construction worker, the first thing they would do is look for jewelry on the fingers and around the neck and on the wrist, because these giants were associated with vast hoards of treasure and gold. And so
they were probably worshipped, right, as gods, and that's why they.
I'm sure they were. Yeah. I'm sure they were in some cases, and we're dealing with both pre-flood, the remains of pre-flood entities and post-flood entities. The post-flood entities are always smaller and are more associated with, obviously, post-flood cultures like the Egyptians, who we found evidence in Sardinia that the ancient Egyptians were hiring the Sardinian giant races, basically as mercenaries and builders. And you'll find that this is a common thread throughout post-flood history, is that the mound builders and the giants, and in some cases when we say giants, we're talking about 7 foot to 9 foot tall giants. So we're talking about some of these giants are like NBA basketball players, but with genetic deviations. We're talking about very, very strong, robust entities that are not fully human, as opposed to just tall human beings. But then sometimes you're also dealing with giants ranging from the 9 to the 12 foot tall region, or from the 10 to the 12 foot tall region. And then in some cases you're finding 12 to 15. And of course, 15 plus, which is much rarer accounts of 15 plus foot giants. Sometimes these giants have elongated skulls, sometimes they have red hair, sometimes they have 6 fingers and 6 toes. And one thing I can guarantee you is that they absolutely existed. This race of giants, this race of hybrid, non-human entities of very unusual stature and strength, and again, who were very robust in terms of their skeletal structure. And so again, this is a worldwide phenomenon, but especially as it relates to the United States and the mound builders, there is a direct correlation with Sardinia, and that will be part of the content. We will feature that content in episode 3.
Right. Before we go in, back in towards sort of the pyramid structures and stuff, the question that I really have in terms of the giants and the different kinds of giants you found, were they just kind of like a descendant that ended with these guys, or do you think they passed on their genetics somewhere?
Are we talking post-flood giants?
Post-flood, yeah. So
Because there's a divide between pre-flood giants and post-flood giants. We know that the Bible says in Genesis chapter 6 that there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. And we know that the also after that includes the post-flood time, the post-flood ages, because we find giants occurring not only in the biblical narrative, but also in the narratives of many other cultures. Every primary civilization on Earth has a giant mythos, and also a mythos of the flood and of the gods that descended. And many of these cultures, such as the Inca, and some of the native cultures that were subdued by the Inca, knew that the giants that existed in the world before the flood of Noah, or before the Great Flood, they wouldn't call it the flood of Noah, before the Great Flood, were of greater stature, were taller, were bigger, were more monstrous than the giants that appeared in the world after the flood. So this was a ubiquitous knowledge all over the earth, that there were giants in the world before the flood, and there were giants in the world after the flood, and the giants that came after the flood were of a lesser stock than those that existed in the world before the flood. This again it occurs in the mythos of every primary, specifically that there were giants in the earth, occurs in the mythos of every primary culture on earth. In the case of Peru specifically, we document in episode 1 of our True Legends documentary series called Technology of the Fallen, we document and we show documentation coming from the 16th century that the bones of giants were uncovered and confiscated in Peru during the conquest of the Incan Empire. Now, if you accept the narrative of the chroniclers who recorded the history of the conquest of Peru, which is the accepted historical account that we find in our history books today, these same chroniclers, these same historians are telling us in the same documents from which we derive the history of the conquest of Peru, that the bones of giants were discovered. Not only the bones of giants, because we have a lot of detractors and critics who will say they were mistaking the bones. The chroniclers, these were uneducated people. They were mistaking these bones for the bones of mastodons and giant sloths and dinosaurs and so forth. The problem is that we have records, again, from the same guys that were recording the conquest, were writing history concerning the conquest, Pizarro and the 200 or so conquistadors who decimated the Incan Empire. These same guys recorded that in some cases, the mummified bodies of giants dressed in cumbia, dressed in traditional native ceremonial clothes, were discovered. In one particular instance, the bodies of giants were discovered in a cave. They were dressed in cumbia, and they were being worshipped as the progenitors of those people, of the natives. And these giants were very, very large. They were said to be 3 times the size of human beings of normal stature. So even if the Indians were only 5 foot tall, you're still dealing with 15-foot giants. And they had elongated skulls, deformed. They described them as having deformed skulls, which I think that we can safely assume that we're dealing with elongated skulls, and that's why the natives were in many cases engaging in cranial deformation with headboarding to emulate the gods, to emulate the shape of the heads of the gods who they were worshiping as their progenitors, not because they had these fairy tales concerning these giants, but because they had the bodies, the remains of these giants, the entire mummified bodies of these giants enshrined in a cave, dressed in cumbia, ceremonial cloth, and it was apparent to the chroniclers, by the way, it was the royal inspectors, the visitadores they were called. They were working for the Kingdom of Spain in conjunction with the Roman Catholic Church, agents of the Roman Catholic Church, with the chroniclers and the monks and the priests from the different orders of the Catholic Church. So you had on one hand you had the visitadores, the royal inspectors from Spain, and you had the agents of Rome, who were also, many of them, Spanish, but they were working, of course, for the Holy See. Right. Both of these groups together were chronicling these encounters with the natives as they were laboring to extirpate idolatry among the natives. In other words, they were there to exterminate the idolatrous practices of the natives and to force the natives to submit to the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. While they were engaged in this activity, they were burning all of the idols that the natives had. So understand, they're going through Peru. Again, the royal inspectors from Spain, together with the agents of Rome, the Catholic Church, are going through the regions of Peru, which at that time, Peru also occupied Ecuador and Bolivia, the Incan Empire. And they're finding whatever artifacts the natives are worshiping, and they are burning them, along with many of the priests among the natives, the pagan priests. I mean, they're burning these priests along with their artifacts, and they're committing atrocities in the spirit of the Inquisition. The Inquisition was alive and well. The Jesuits came not long after the conquistadors to continue the dastardly work of the Inquisition, the bloodthirsty activities of those inquisitors. And as they're destroying the idols, as they're destroying the artifacts of the pagan religions of these natives, they're finding that the natives are actually worshiping the mummified bodies of gigantic humanoids. Okay, so again, I went through that detailed explanation so that people will understand that what I just told you literally comes from the exact same documents, historical documents from the library, the Congressional Library in Peru, from the same documents that you get your history of the conquest of Peru, of the Incan Empire, that you read in your history books in first grade and all the way up through high school and even into the university level.
It's a perfect example of controlling the information that gets out there through the education system, and you can omit certain aspects, but once they've been highlighted, you got your apologists, right, to say, oh yeah, it's the people just weren't, they didn't know what they were looking at. That's a real classic that it's used a lot, I think, even in the case of other cases that have been out there. I've heard that being excused by the authorities in the institutions to try to poo-poo the idea that goes away from their, evolutionary narrative or whatever.
Sounds like you got some construction work going on over there.
Honestly, we talked for a while before the thing, and then as soon as we start, this guy just won't go away out there. Can you hear me okay, though? Is it like...
Yeah, I can hear like a table saw or something going in the background, too.
They're really coming after me now. Okay, so let's talk about... So those giants, I guess, do you think there are people walking around today that have that mixture genetically from the giants, or whatever happened, that those gods, or the ones that were worshipped, do they, because like you said, some of the natives, some of the tribes, they worship them as sort of their, almost their creator, like they...
So progenitors,
right? Yeah. So is there any kind of genetic crossover? Are there humans walking around that might have some of this genetics?
Yeah, I think there is. By the way, for those who are interested in fact-checking what I just said, you can look up you're going to have to be able to read Spanish, but some of these chroniclers and historians include Bernabe Cobo, Antonio de la Calancha, and guys like César de Leon. So these accounts are in the historical documents, but have been omitted for one reason or another in the official historical accounts of the conquest of Peru. So for those who want to do some more digging, Agustin de Zarate, and there's a host of chroniclers, about 6, maybe even 7, who mention the bones of giants and giants. But to your question, I found it very enlightening when I discovered in the historical accounts from Peru that some of these giants were being described as having deformed heads. And the way that the text is written in the account, it really could read a couple of different ways, but the sense that you get is that they're describing very large, abnormally large heads, which I believe is a direct reference to elongated skulls. And I find it interesting that the natives referred to these giants, again, whom they were worshiping, as their progenitors. And so they had deified this race of giants and saw themselves as the offspring of this divine race.
Right.
And so now we can talk about elongated skulls and the elongated skull phenomenon, especially as it pertains to Peru and Paracas. L.A. Marsuli is doing a lot of work with the elongated skulls phenomenon, along with Brian Forster in Peru, specifically in the Cusco region, and in the region of it slipped my mind, Paracas, Peru, which is near the coast, and which is a very arid region. So you have a lot of mummies that are discovered there near the Atacama Desert. Actually, the Atacama Desert is more to the south, where there are actually a lot of elongated skulls discovered as well. In fact, one of the most ridiculous elongated skulls I've ever seen, and it's in our film, The Unholy Sea, the second edition of our documentary film series, was discovered in the Atacama Desert, which is, of course, where the Atacama humanoid came out of, was discovered also, the little creature that was featured in the documentary Sirius. So there's some and the reason why there's so many discoveries in the Atacama Desert, bizarre discoveries in terms of mummified remains of humans and these weird entities, is precisely because it is so arid. It really doesn't get any rainfall at all. So the preservation is extreme. And so, again, I saw one of the most freakish elongated skulls I've ever seen. And anybody who claims that was this particular image was the result of headboarding has to deal with some very practical problems, such as when you shape the human skull, which you can. Everybody knows that when a baby's born, their skull is very soft. In fact, their cranium is very soft. In fact, if you have a baby that spends too much time on their back, the baby will develop a flat head. Or on their side, one particular side, that baby will develop, that side of their head will be disproportionately flat compared to the other side. Right. So the idea of shaping the skull, it's a practice that happens. It's ubiquitous all over the earth in a lot of different cultures because it is so easy to do at the infant level. I mean, you can shape the cranium in very bizarre ways, even very pointed cones. But what you cannot do is you cannot add additional mass to the cranium, and you cannot create additional cranial capacity inside of the cranium. In other words, you're not going to make the brains any bigger, and you're not going to increase the size of the brain cavity. which is exactly what we find with many of these elongated skulls. Not all of them. Many of them are the result of cranial deformation and headboarding. But some of them, I am absolutely convinced, for a number of reasons, that at least some of them are not the result of cranial deformation, but are in fact the result of genetic deviation. In other words, there's something genetically unusual. Let's say that there's something unusual in the genome of these particular entities. And let me make 2 points about this while I'm thinking about it. Number one, to answer your question more poignantly, yes, I do believe that there are some of the genetic components from the giants and from the hybrids that made it to the other side of the flood do exist today, and I believe are evident in some of the remains of these elongated skull creatures, these elongated skull humanoids, to a degree. The second point I want to make is this. Just because you get genetic testing done on a skeleton with an elongated skull and a cranium that is displaying a very acute elongated skull, just because that genetic testing reveals that the subject, the specimen in question, is human or mainly human, does not mean that there are not genes present in that genome that are unusual.
Right.
Because many times they cannot sequence the entirety of the genome. And those genetic components, those genes, could be embedded anywhere in that genome. They would have to specifically find exactly where that genetic aberration is located. You cannot just get 90% of the genome sequenced and say, oh, there's nothing unusual here. There's obviously something unusual because of the phenotype is expressing the genotype. In other words, there is a physical manifestation of a genetic alteration.
Right. Right.
And
somewhere the code
provided, somewhere there is a snippet of DNA inside of the entirety of that genome embedded somewhere, and it could be small. It could be a very small snippet of DNA that is existent inside of that genome that is causing the phenotypic distinction. In other words, the physical manifestation of an elongated skull that is not only elongated, but also displays some features that are very unusual when juxtaposed with regular human anatomy.
Right.
And so I think that there's a lot of intellectuals out there who are trying to sound smarter than guys like L.A. Marzulli, who are doing these getting this genetic testing done on these specimens, elongated skull specimens, and they're sitting back saying, this isn't genetic. It's ridiculous to think this is genetic. This is just cradle headboarding. This is just cranial deformation. Even when you do get the genetic testing, it's going to show that it's human or that it's primarily human, blah, blah, blah. But they're discounting the fact that it only takes a very small amount of deviant genetic information to be present in the genome, depending on where it is in the genome, not just how much information is there. The genome is so complex. It also depends on where specifically that snippet, that gene is located in the totality of that genome, which is very large and very complex, that can give you the manifestation of an elongated skull. So we need to think in complex terms. When we look at, when we think about giants, when we think about the genes of giants, you could have, there could be individuals walking around the earth at this time who are alive, who have, let's just call them Nephilim components, still latent in their genomes that are unactivated, but are present. Latent Nephilim genes that are present, that are residues of prominent Nephilim races.
Yeah, it seems like those that were prominent were explicitly wiped out by God. Then that's part of the bigger narrative that's never discussed in the churches with the Bible in the Old Testament is God going after those giant tribes. But that complexity you bring up is so important for people to grasp because, if you really think about genetics and DNA and what we understand about it, our DNA changes with, what we eat, how we consume things, like, all the GMO stuff we're bombarded with, it's changing us at a genetic level. I mean, there's no question that kind of stuff is happening. So, and then you look at even biblically, Nimrod became a Gibborim, and, that whole concept of something changed in Nimrod, it doesn't always have to be a mating process. And I think people get stuck on that. Like, oh, how could they have how could they pass down the genetics? Well, I mean, look, today in laboratories, we're doing it. CRISPR technology has allowed any DNA biotechnician or whatever to go in there and start manipulating DNA. So that's already happening in labs today. Who knows what kind of technology was being accessed or has been accessed throughout the centuries. And, I would say that, and I think you'd agree with me to some extent, is in the antediluvian world, this sort of stuff was almost, common ground, probably at a much more raw kind of process, not so much laboratory settings in the way we, think of it. What are your thoughts on that in terms of that ancient technology being much more in line with nature than we expect?
Well, we have to understand what we're dealing with, who we're dealing with. We're dealing with the Benai Elohim,
right?
The sons of God in the Old Testament, who shouted for joy when the earth was created. They were there when the rudimentary constituents of matter were being assembled.
Right.
They understand physics better than any human being could ever possibly hope to understand physics. They understand genetics. And when I say they, I mean the Benai Elohim, the sons of God, these angelic entities, including the Watchers, which may in fact be a description of occupation rather than actually defining a certain kind of angelic creature. In other words, the Watchers could be all kinds of different things that are occupying a very specific task.
It's a job description rather than...
In other words, it's a job description, right? So these entities are vastly superior in terms of intelligence to the human race, and I can say that definitively because the Bible says that we were created to be a little lower than the angels. And understand that when it says that we were created to be a little lower than the angels, it's referring to our progenitor, Adam, was created to be a little lower than the angels. And Adam was much more of a human. Let's put it very simply. Adam was more human than you and I.
He was the purest human.
He was the prototypical human. He was the first. He had no genetic defect in the beginning until sin and death entered in. He was Superman in every sense of the word. I mean, in every sense of the description of what that means. In other words, he was the apex of our race. He was smarter than we are. He was stronger than we are. He certainly lived way longer than we do. His eyesight was probably unimaginable. His hearing, he probably was able to discern and to see and to hear things that we can no longer discern and see and hear. His mental capacity was off the charts. in comparison to ours. Is it possible that he could have communicated telepathically with Eve and with other entities? I don't see why not. The brain is an amazing tool. Created by God, given to our species specifically. It is an absolute, we're just beginning to understand the basic operations of the brain. So when the Bible says that Adam was created a little lower than that we were created a little lower than the angels, you have to think of Adam, the apex of our species. And yet, he was still a little lower than the entities in the category above him. So even when dealing with the apex of our species, these entities that we glibly call angels were superior to the human race. So when you look at the Genesis 6 narrative, the Watchers event, you have to understand that you're dealing with the B'nai Elohim, who were there, again, when the constituents of matter were forming, and the genetic code of the human race and of all life on earth. These guys understand science. We are observing science. Even the best of our scientists, the most haughty and elevated of our scientific minds, even throughout history, take the best scientific minds, take your Stephen Hawkins and your Einsteins, and their knowledge is nothing compared to the lowliest angel. They are observing to the best of their ability in terms of our scientists. They are making simplistic observations about the natural order. These entities who we're referring to, the B'nai Elohim, were watching the laws of physics and the laws of nature begin. They saw the mechanism get set into motion from the very beginning. So the reason why I point that out is we have to have that kind of an understanding when looking back into the pre-flood world and dealing with the Watchers. These guys knew how to manipulate both physics, genetics, any kind of science that you want to name. These guys were far more brilliant than any of us could ever hope to be. So it's plausible and it's likely that when we talk about producing offspring, that it wasn't just a rude sexual encounter. I'm sure that that was happening also because if you read the book of Enoch, you're going to find out that there was a lust component involved. So yes, they were lusting after the daughters of men. There was a component of sensuality involved in what happened with the Watchers.
Right.
So on a very base level, they wanted to copulate with human women, but we have to understand that there was also something scientific, some advanced knowledge that was involved in the tampering on the genetic level that was occurring in those times, not only with the human race, but also with beasts. They were also copulating and playing with the genetic structure of animal life on Earth as well, if you give any credence to the other scrolls that were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, such as the Book of Giants.
Right. Yeah. And you know the special knowledge or the the forbidden knowledge, I think, is the way some translations of the Book of Enoch have it. It explicitly says that the Watchers gave humankind that knowledge that they shouldn't have had, and that was part of their punishment is that they crossed the barriers, the lines of division that God had created, the barriers between maybe species, if you want to call it that, between these angelic beings and humans, especially after the fall. I think something was separated there with realities, I think, that either dimensionally or whatever, and I think it ties into what you were saying, that the extra perceptions, and sort of the more supernatural, the telekinetic abilities and stuff that are latent, I think, in human beings. There's actually been scientific evidence to prove that all humans have this psi level, where the body, there was a visual test. Chris Putnam talked about it. I mentioned it in a couple of videos ago, where they did experiments, and it's been verified, a couple times over, where people, they have a response, a physiological response to images before the images are shown. And it's consistent,
That's right.
erotic images or whatever. That experiment really does show that the human being has this intuitive nature in relationship to creation that is quite profound. And
we've all experienced it.
Yeah,
all of us have
absolutely.
experienced deja vu. All of us have experienced having a feeling that you know something before it's told to you. You get a gut feeling. We refer to it as a feeling in our gut. Right. And then you find out that exactly what you were, the premonition you were feeling happened to be true. So there's obviously sensory faculties connected to this equipment,
right,
the human form. Faculties that are directly related to our genotypic makeup, and that are, as you said, latent. And I've been saying on the radio on numerous occasions that I believe that part of the reason why they're latent in human beings, why they're deactivated, there's a twofold reason in my mind. Number one, because we have greatly devolved from Adam. We are, in fact, evolving. I don't believe in evolution. I certainly believe in devolution. We are devolving. We are devolving and are in a state of decay, genetically speaking, and that has been proven.
right,
Unequivocally. We are not gaining, our genomes are not gaining information. They are losing information. We are atrophying, genetically speaking. So that's one fact and one factor that contributes to this idea that there are latent mechanisms, latent abilities within the human genome. The second thing is I believe that God himself has created a dampering effect, has built in a firewall for our protection. Because if we are going to be, there are things that if we were continually exposed to concerning the nature of reality, our equipment we can't use our equipment the way that we used to be able to use it, so we can no longer process reality on the same level. And what it would lead to is if we were still exposed to all of this, let's just call it, for the sake of argument, extra-dimensional reality around us, without the ability to rightly process it, it would lead to madness.
Right. That's what
in the human psyche.
Yeah, and that's why I think people with schizophrenia, people with all these different disorders, not just schizophrenia, but any kind of experience, people seek it with drugs. The ayahuasca thing is big. It's a reality. People just don't like to admit it, but. Yeah, I agree, man. There's definitely something there. Now,
and there's a cost. There's a cost for those who reactivate through illicit means, because there are. I lived in the Amazon, and the witch doctor culture that exists in the Amazon. On one level, it's kind of a joke to modern minds. You picture these primitive, uneducated men dancing around in skirts and masks and, blowing cigarette smoke in people's face and so forth. And it is primitive and it is ignorant, but it's also very real, because some of these individuals, not all of them, most of them are plagiarizers and performers and posers, but some of them have made contact with demonic entities that have enabled them to reactivate some of those latent things in their genetic makeup, in the physical equipment that we have as human beings, in our brains and in the other faculties that we have in our anatomy. And many of these guys are actually also empowered by entities to do things that defy what we would consider the limits of the natural world and the limits of physics. These guys can do some very, very scary things. I saw, and I've said this on numerous occasions, I have seen, let me bring up a couple of things here. I have seen, first and foremost, the most terrifying, one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen in my life, regarding the repercussions of messing with these witch doctors, was a woman. I went to see this woman with a pastor friend of mine named Benny Humphreys in Tarapoto, Peru. And Benny took me to visit this woman who had recently visited a witch doctor. And the witch doctors will often, again, many of them are posers. Many of them are it's just an industry. Right. Some of them are the real deal, tapped into really nasty spirits that are controlling them and using them, and with whom they have intercourse. And this woman went to visit this witch doctor to put a hex on another individual. So from the beginning, you're dealing with a very sinful heart, somebody who has a grudge against somebody else who wants to do them harm. Right. This woman visited this witch doctor with the intent to do harm to someone else. Oftentimes, these witch doctors will tell you you have to go and acquire a personal possession of this person. Sometimes an article of clothing, sometimes a picture, something that they're in possession of that belongs to them. And you bring it to the witch doctor, and they perform a ceremonial hex on this person or on their family. And very dark and sinister things oftentimes occur in the aftermath. Sometimes it backfires, and the dark and sinister things happen to either the witch doctor or to the person that is acquiring the service of the witch doctor. And in this case, it was this woman, because I think it was in a very short period of time after she went to put a hex on somebody that all of the bones in her body fused together. And it was a terrible sight to behold. Here was a woman lying in bed, skinny, dying, in absolute agony, trapped in the prison of her body. All she could do was moan, and her bones were fused together. She could no longer move her body. Her bones were stiff and fused together. Now, is there some kind of medical explanation that would dispel the notion that it had anything to do with the witch doctor or some kind of a demonic phenomenon? Possibly. Well, but I'll tell you what,
they can probably explain the mechanics of it, but not.
When I was standing in front of this woman, I can tell you, for whatever it's worth, that there is something very dark and demonic in that room with this woman, and it happened. I think it might have happened the day after. So was it a coincidence? You may draw the conclusion, not you personally, but some of your listeners may draw the conclusion that it was pure coincidence. Fine. But I've seen it too many times for me to discount the possibility of a demonic repercussion from this kind of activity. I've seen all kinds of crazy things that have demonstrated to me unequivocally that there are a few different things happening in terms of metaphysics regarding people who attempt to tap into these latent, whether they be the latent abilities that are present in the human genome, or acquiring the empowerment or beseeching the empowerment of extra-dimensional entities, or are in fact possessed by these hybrid spirits, the unclean spirits. Right. I've seen cases which could probably fit one of those, numerous cases that could certainly fit one of those categories. And it's a very real phenomenon when you expose yourself to what people call, some people call them gateway drugs, not in the sense that these drugs are gateways to worse drugs, but in the sense that these drugs are gateways to entities that come and take up residence in your life, whether it be in a possessing mode, or whether it be just they now have authority to interact with you in a way that they did not before, because you gave them that authority. You opened the door, you invited them to interact with you, and they will empower you. They will do things for you, but at a cost. There's always something that they want from you, and it's always very costly. And in one case, it's been described to me on numerous occasions, the activity that happens when individuals engage in an ayahuasca ceremony in the jungles of South America. Ayahuasca is very popular. Sometimes it's an innocuous thing where a group of guys will get together, take ayahuasca, and just end up puking their brains out. All night. But other times, if you have a true practitioner of the occult conducting the ayahuasca ceremony, they will actually call and beseech and beckon certain entities to come and to participate and to take up residence in the lives of those who are participating in the ayahuasca ceremony. It's been described to me on a couple of occasions that there are certain ceremonies in which, and this is the most common ceremony, ritual related to ayahuasca if you're dealing with a true occult practitioner, in other words, a true witch doctor in the Amazon, is they'll have a group of people sit in a circle. They'll go through this ritual involving smoke, involving a certain kind of music and chanting and dancing, and the participants will take the ayahuasca with a very particular mix of ayahuasca, and then these witch doctors summon entities to come into the center of the circle by name, and these entities come and they will go from person to person, and they will choose who they will either inhabit or who they will choose as their, I can only think of a derogatory term at this point, who they will choose to be their host.
Yeah.
Let's just put it that way. And I've had these participants describe to me that they were in the midst of this ayahuasca ceremony, and suddenly they saw an entity come into the center of the circle. And this entity would come up, would one by one, would come and look into the face of each participant, and then boom, would go inside of one. Oof. And I'll tell you this, and I guess I'm kind of going down a rabbit trail here, Gons, but one time I had a dream. This was the most vivid dream I've ever had in my life. And I'm not sure it was a dream, to be honest with you.
Right.
Let's call it a dream. I had a dream one night while I was living in Peru. I've never done ayahuasca. I've never been involved in the occult. I've actually never, ever done any kind of narcotics, never smoked a joint. I'm not saying that to aggrandize myself or to pat myself on the back. I'm saying it so that you'll understand what I'm about to tell you, the sobriety of what I'm about to tell you. I went to bed one night, and this is an important little detail. There was a glass bottle sitting on my windowsill. I went to bed and I had this dream, and I have to call it a dream because I don't know how else to explain it, but it did not feel like a dream, but for lack of a better term, it was a dream in which I saw, and this might resonate with somebody out there. You might get an email. I might get an email after I say this because I've never said it on the air. There was a ceremony happening, and there were some lanterns hanging, and some torches, some bonfires lit, and it was in the jungle. And there was a clearing in the jungle, and there were individuals involved in this ceremony. Many of them were dressed in robes. I could tell that there were witch doctors present, medicine men, whatever you want to call them, who were present at this ceremony. And the main component of this ceremony was a circle. There was a device. It was a circular device. The circular device had two components to it. There were two circles. There was a circle within a circle. It was like Wheel of Fortune. There was a wheel. The inner wheel moved. The inner wheel could be spun. or the outer wheel. I can't remember if it was the inner or the outer wheel. Either the inner or the outer wheel could be spun, and the other one was fixed. So let's say, for the lack to clarify this, let's say the outer wheel was fixed, couldn't be moved, but the inner wheel could be spun. And there were characters, hieroglyphs on the wheels, and they were separated, and like a Wheel of Fortune wheel, where instead of the numbers, instead of the dollar signs and so forth, there were very strange arcane hieroglyphs on both the stationary wheel and on the wheel that could be spun. And there were individuals sitting cross-legged around the wheel, around the perimeter of the wheel, in front of certain symbols. And they were dressed in occult garb, in other words, in robes. And in the center of these wheels was an open space. It was an open circular space, and it was just dirt underneath it. And the wheels were made of wood. And it was this device where you could spin the inner wheel, the outer wheel remained stationary, and within the inner wheel was an open circle of ground. And what happened was, one of the individuals would spin the wheel. And depending on how the symbols from the two wheels, the outer and the inner wheel, aligned, certain things would happen. Well, I was, in the dream, a participant in this activity. Actually, to be honest with you, that's not true. I was actually an outside observer at this point to this activity, because I was kind of having a bird's eye view, walking around, looking at all of this, observing all of this. So it's almost as if I was floating around looking at all of this. I became a participant later on. And so somebody spun the wheel. One of these guys spun the wheel. And a certain symbol aligned in front of one of the participants sitting around the circle. And as soon as it happened, this person became very nervous and wanted to get up and run. But the other participant stood up and grabbed the person and threw them into the center of the circle. And again, it wasn't a small circle, it was a large circle. So it was a very large circle of dirt in between these two circles, within the perimeters of these two circles. And this individual was kind of waiting there, looking around, very nervous. And suddenly, an entity appeared, for lack of a better term, a monster, a very grotesque humanoid creature appeared in the midst of the circles and devoured the person that had been thrown into the middle. And it was sort of a blood sacrifice. And it was very cultic, very dark. To make a long story short, something happened to where they could no longer control this entity. The entity was confined within the circular space. He could not leave the circular space. Something happened, I don't remember what triggered it, where they lost control of the entity. In other words, the participants who were participating in this occult ritual lost control of the entity that had just devoured this individual who had been tossed into the middle. It broke out, and it was pandemonium. Everybody was running and screaming, and this entity was just tearing them down one by one. I mean, it was large, and it would grab with it. It had a very large mouth, and it would just, bite off the head of somebody or tear off an arm of another person. It was pandemonium. And suddenly I went from being a passive observer. Suddenly I found myself one of these participants running for their lives from this creature. And what was so frightening was that the creature was pursuing me. I suddenly was one of these participants, and the creature grabbed me, and it was like I was in its jaws, and it snapped down on my body, and I felt the pain for a brief second of my back breaking in its jaws. But just at that moment, somebody or something knocked the glass jar off of my windowsill so that I would wake up.
That's crazy.
And I woke up because the glass jar came flying off of my windowsill, hit the ground, broke into a million pieces, and I instantly was awake, sitting up, sweating, breathing heavily in my bed. And so I believe that I got a glimpse, was given a glimpse of something that was actually happening, of something real.
Maybe a nearby ritual happening, and
Very possibly.
And as you fell into sleep, the theories are that you kind of have a spirit body that might, be able to observe things differently, and maybe you got caught up in some of that. That's crazy. That's really
and why I think it happened was this, because I had enemies in Peru, and they were witch doctors. I had a group of witch doctors who were my adversaries. They were performing all kinds of rituals specifically against me and my family. I basically almost throughout we had a prayer ministry in Peru, in the city of Tarapoto, which is in the Amazon basin. And I, at one period of time, we actually were ran out of a particular area in town that was controlled by a group of witch doctors. And at one time, while I lived entrenched in all of these witch doctors, there's a very famous place, people can look it up online to verify my story. It's called Takiwasi. Takiwasi is a drug rehab center where the participants are exposed to this kind of witchcraft. And basically, they're drug addicts, whether it be cocaine or heroin or whatever, and they use ayahuasca to cleanse them of their addiction. But oftentimes, it comes at a very high cost because demonic activity begins to appear in their life. And during this period of time that I'm describing, I lived next to that center. So I lived in between Takiwasi, and then right down behind me was a retreat for witch doctors, a very private retreat for witch doctors. And so I was in the belly of the beast.
Right.
And during that time, I was actually discovering for about a week, I was finding big black tarantulas always on my door. To the room that we stayed in. I was renting a little hostel. I was actually renting the whole thing for this ministry. And there would be big, large tarantulas on my door. I remember, and just for the span of this week, always finding these tarantulas on my door. And one of the guys that worked for me, that was sort of the groundskeeper, Peruvian guy, told me, this is witchcraft. He told me, Tim, this is witchcraft. You need to be careful because this isn't normal. This is one of the signs that somebody's doing some intense witchcraft against you. He said, finding poisonous creatures constantly around you and in very strange and unusual situations. Well, I found one morning or one night, my baby, at the time my first son was a baby, laying in his crib, and I happened to look down, and I found bullet ants crawling on his body. Bullet ants are ants that are that big, about an inch, and are very poisonous. They have a stinger, and they can easily kill an infant. Yeah. In fact, I looked over, and there was a bullet ant crawling across his face, which he didn't get stung. Okay, so I killed it, and so I'm finding big black tarantulas on my door. I'm finding bullet ants in my sleeping quarters, and during that period of time, my wife got up early. She used to get up early to wash clothes by hand, wash clothes at this outdoor sink. The sink was a cement basin. And there's a cement wall, and on the wall were two handles to turn the water on, one handle to turn the water on. Right. And there was the handle was all by itself against a cement wall, and there was a cement basin in front of it. So the spigot was coming right out of the cement wall there. There was nothing attached to it. It was coming right out of the middle of the cement wall, and there was a cement basin. Well, one morning, This is a true story. My wife went to wash clothes. She went to turn the spigot, but something stopped her, and she looked up first. And what she saw was a snake coiled around the spigot in a strike position.
Wow.
Coiled around the spigot. If you know anything about snakes, they don't coil around cold spigots in the morning. Right. They're out in the sun. Number one. Number two, I don't see how a snake could have gotten to that spigot.
Yeah.
It had to be placed on that spigot. And it was a poisonous snake. I forget exactly which kind. I think it was what we call a hirgon in the Amazon. A very deadly snake. My groundskeeper came running over to my wife when she screamed because she found the snake there, and he chopped its head off with a machete. And it was a poisonous snake.
That's crazy.
So this is the kind of activity, this is the kind of stuff that happens when you begin to contend with these witch doctors that I'm talking about. So, and the reason why I said all that was because it was in that context where I was having contention with these witch doctors. Actually, it was a little later on, but we were still having contention with these witch doctors always when I had that dream. And so I think I was given a bird's eye view of what some of these guys were actually involved in and what was happening.